Well, hello everyone and welcome to our webinar. My name is Greg Hansen and I'm part of the strategy team at Hub24. I'm really looking forward to today's session. I've been following Rocky Scoppoliti and his work for nearly 10 years now. Rocky is a world-renowned futurologist and has shown great insight into issues such as demographic change and digital technology and the consequences of those things on our economy and our society. And today, Rocky's going to take us through a range of issues that are highly relevant to financial planners. Much of it is drawn from his recent book, Australia 2030, Where the Bloody Hell Are We? As I say, I'm really looking forward to the session. So firstly, Rocky, welcome.
Thank you, Greg. And look, it's terrific to spend this time with your audience and take you through some fascinating insights really about the decade ahead. And so I'm going to anchor the presentation around this question: how do we increase our capacity to adapt to a world of accelerated change? Now, I've been researching this question for some 17 years now. Now, some of you might be thinking, my goodness, hasn't he answered this question after 17 years of research? Well, what's fascinating about this question is that unlike a puzzle, where we might know that there is an answer to the question or a pathway to an answer, this question here behaves more like a mystery, where just when we think we've understood what's going on here, there's a twist and a turn. And so the fascinating thing about this question is that it really characterizes the environment upon which we are living in and will increasingly be living in over the coming decade. Now, I want to introduce you to two wonderful words that have profoundly influenced and shaped my life, and in fact go a long way into answering the question. The first word is youthquake. Now, I asked a friend of mine if he knew what this word youthquake meant, and his response to me at the time when I was doing the research was he thought it was a type of headache that young people give their parents. And I thought, well, not a bad guess. But youthquake is in fact defined as a significant cultural shift and political and social shift associated with the influence of young people. And it was first termed by the editor-in-chief of Vogue magazine to explain the demographic change that was going on in the 60s. And so the idea that I want to seed with you is on the back of a youthquake, there comes significant opportunities. For example, in the mid-60s, we saw the rise of consumer finance, the unquenchable thirst by baby boomers for home ownership, for consumer electronics and the like. Now, what's fascinating is that youthquake was termed by the Oxford Dictionary as the 2017 word of the year to really explain the phenomena associated with what's going on with the millennials. That is, those that are broadly aged between about 20 and 40 years today. Now, what's fascinating is that millennials are the children of baby boomers. And so the question and the idea that we need to be looking at here is, if we know that there is significant opportunity on the back of a significant social, cultural and political change, as we saw in the mid-60s with the baby boomer generation, what can we expect is going to occur with millennials? And I'll step you through some insights around that. The second word that has profoundly shifted and changed the way I've thought about our future is this wonderful word juvenescence, which is a 19th century Latin word defined as the constant state or period of youthfulness. Now, the reason why this word is so important is because we've sort of come to this point where we've been led to believe that transformation, digital transformation, is what assures us success in our future. But the research clearly shows that our success is no longer associated with a once-off big digital transformation event. In fact, your success in the future is defined by your constant capacity to adapt. And this is about rejuvenation. rather than thinking about change as a once-off event. So sit those two words in the back of your mind as we go through the presentation. Now, I'm going to take you through some really, really fascinating insights that are really going to be based around these four areas. What is disruption associated with the business model? What's happening in the economy? Trust. And of course, we're going to get into some of those fascinating predictions out for 2030. But I'm going to contextualize this in an environment that is associated with low economic growth, demographic change, and emerging technologies. So let's get into it. Let's look at demographic influence. Now, what I would say here is we need to think about this from two bookends perspective. We have an aging population, and we've also got a world that is going to be led by millennials. And so intergenerational disruption is really important to consider here for a variety of reasons. Now, why should financial services providers be interested in millennials? Well, I would say there's three key reasons why you need to be interested in millennials. The first is they've already become the most significant generation when it comes to the production of income. This demographic group, which represents 2 in 3 in the workforce today, will increasingly become the primary producers of income. And that income will be dispersed in different ways compared to what it's done before in the past. Their investment capacity by 2030 will be 5 times more of the world's wealth, equaling to about 35 US trillion. Now, when it comes to thinking about debt, we've got to think about this quite differently with this generation, because this is the first generation that we've stuffed with student debt. And in fact, student debt in the US now has become the largest consumer category of credit. So we need to think very thoughtfully about this demographic for that reason. Now, to help put some perspectives on this in terms of sort of really illustrating the point, I created a measure which is called the average economic value. Now, the average economic value is the sum of all that you have in savings as well as your borrowing capacity. And when I looked at this across a whole range of countries, what I found in Australia over on the left-hand side of the page here is that millennials are about to overtake the average of the population in terms of their economic capacity. So in other words, they are becoming increasingly important as the primary producers on sources of income, as I mentioned before, together with their borrowing capacity compared to the average of the total population. Now, when you look across some other countries, you don't see that same profile as what you see here in Australia. Singapore, for example, as well as the United Arab Emirates, we don't sort of see that kind of profile. Now, to bring this into perspective, let's look at the transition process. So now, looking at the capacity of millennials to become the primary producers of profit to providers of financial services, we can see that baby boomers are proportionately in decline. So in other words, the proportionate income that you're receiving from this demographic is in decline. Gen X, which is those that are broadly aged between about sort of, from about 35, 40 years of age to about mid-50s, will carry the profitability payload for you out to what's projected to be about 2030. But millennials are now reaching this inflection point, and this generation is increasing and growing in terms of its proportionate contribution of profit to your businesses. Now, and then of course, when we look at Gen Z, they'll overtake millennials, in the outer years around 2050, and then the generation that will follow will have the same pattern and trend. Now, what's fascinating here is that this transition where millennials are becoming the primary producers of profit to the financial services sector is happening much sooner and will exist for much longer than what we've thought before in the past. Okay, let's talk about aging population. Now, why is this important? It's important for the productivity imperative that's really facing us here in Australia over the coming decade. Now, when we look at the old age dependency ratio in Australia, represented by the green line in this graph, you can see that we have been in decline since 2010, and we will stay in decline through to about 2050. That means that the proportion of people aged between 25 and 64 years versus those that are 65 years will continue to decrease from 3.2 in the 2010 down to 2.6 by 2030. And what this basically means is that, government will have a reduction and see a reduction in its tax revenue, but most importantly, it will also see an increase in spending associated with supporting an older demographic group. And so it's really important that when we think about productivity, that we can't become dependent and reliant on labour to be, the only way that we think about improving productivity through the course of time. And so if we know that this intergenerational transition is occurring, how do Australians feel about a millennial-led Australian? Well, I put that question in the Australia 2030 research that I conducted, which was for 673 Australian professional participants in the study that included 170 chief executives and board directors. And so what we found was that by a large majority, if we look at the total response, we see that most Australians feel very, very comfortable with millennials being better leaders of our organisations, political and religious institutions this coming decade than older leaders of the past decade. Now, you might say, well, this is unsurprising from millennials. They would see it that way, but 8% of millennials actually disagreed with that. And so I think it's important to think about this from a leadership perspective, that yes, other generations do feel very, very comfortable with this intergenerational leadership change that we will see, whereby millennials will become leaders of our institutions and organisations over the coming decade. So there's two really important tipping points that I'd like to summarise around here. The first is, just like their baby boomer parents, who in their youthquake gave rise to the economic boom and the Americanization of the world in many respects, get ready for the millennials who are the children of the baby boomers and their youthquake, which is going to give rise to the next technological boom, and most importantly, the Asianization of the world as the center of economic gravity shifts towards the Asia Pacific region. And so youth voice matters, and it's, again, really, really important for us to think about the aging population. Okay, let's swing into looking at some economic influence. And I would summarize this by saying that national debt will be a stable guest, whether it's welcomed or not, in our economy over the coming decade. But we've come from a decade in the past, from 2010 to 2020, which saw, a cluster of economic conditions that we've never experienced before collectively. And so when we think about this again from a productivity perspective, we've got to be really mindful about the fact that we have reached a point at the end of the decade where our multi-factor productivity and labour productivity has now tipped into the negative. And so we've got to look for alternative ways to address our productivity issue looking forward. And so the other aspect that we've got to now sort of become accustomed to is this low economic environment growth. Now, when I asked participants in the study what their opinions were of, the major issues that affected the world and Australia over the coming 10 years, we can see here represented by the dark green line and the light green line that those who responded in the study before COVID-19, that is those that responded before March of 2020, that we can see that climate change and the environment were the two most was the most significant issue that Australian professionals felt would impact the world and impact Australia. But look at what happened for those who responded to that question over March and April of last year, when we were in the eye of the COVID storm. It shot up for the category of low economic growth by, more than 95% of respondents as being the most significant issue we're going to face over the coming decade. And what this translates into is really an environment where, we have a reduction of confidence, investment, leadership, trust, and ethics of our political actors within the system. And so we've really got to stare into the way with which we think about our policy settings in a very, very different way compared to what we've done in the last decade. And so the two sort of tipping points here, I would say, are really about, accepting that this will be a decade of debt. And in that environment, we really need some new thinking on the capacity of all of our systems, such as, health, education, workforces, technology, and the like. And we've really got to build, systems that are much more resilient for an economy that needs to exist in that environment compared to what we did in the last. Okay, let's talk about trust. Interconnected trust. Now, the idea that I'd ask you to think about here is it's the digital economy's renewable energy. And the idea that I have here is that our traditional notions of trust were never designed for a digital life. And it's what I call the trust trinity, where we are now trusting people, ideas, and platforms, which we never did before in the past. We now put our trust in reviews of our products and services from strangers who are writing reviews about books and all sorts of things online. That's how we're basing our choices and decisions. And we're putting that into platforms that have really brought, the crowd economy together, and so we've got to rethink trust for a digital world, and it really needs to address, these four areas. We really need to think about how interconnected trust needs to incorporate, and will increasingly incorporate, greater degrees of technological involvement. Our appetite for risk and the way with which we look at risk is changing. Who we trust when it comes to institutions has profoundly changed, and it's heading away from a very centralized view of trust, more into a decentralized model. And so when we look at the question of who do we trust, we possibly need to shift that question over into what do we trust. And so on the left-hand side, if we look at the relationship between trust and ethics, we can see that the most trusted and the most ethical of institutions in our society are academic and research institutions. And that's because we are valuing their independence of thinking and thought more so than what we are in the opposite quadrant, perhaps, of those that are least trusted and least perceived as ethical, being government. Now, when we look at sort of the question in the research I did last year on who do we trust the most to control our best interests in the coming years when it comes to technological and scientific developments, we can clearly see it is academic and research institutions by a long shot. And so I would say we're now sort of shifting into that model of shifting away from the question of who do we trust in terms of looking at what do we trust. And so when it comes to then what do we trust, I put that question also to professionals in the study, and we looked at the question of, do you believe that you're going to trust technology more than institutions such as governments and banks over the coming decade? And you can see here that the total represented by the light blue line is more than half of the population. But then when you break it down and sort of look at, you know, putting your trust in robots and also those who associated themselves as being CEOs and board directors also believe that technology will play an increasing role in the way that we think about trust. Now, the fascinating question of would you trust an automated robot or robotic intelligence to make decisions on your behalf? 1 in 3 Australian professionals certainly would. And so the point that I want to get to here is that we shouldn't be thinking about, you know, a trust as being a either or when it comes to technology and individuals. In fact, I believe it's going to be the augmentation. It'll be how people use technology, such as, you know, financial advisors or travel service providers and the like, and it'll be that augmentation that will be the key here, I think, in the way with which we think about trust and the provision of services. And so, you know, the tipping points that we need to think about here are what I refer to as interconnected trust. And that is, you know, thinking about the way with which you augment these new wonderful technologies such as blockchain, privacy enhancing techniques, in the relationship between your business and your customers. And we've really got to prepare for a new distributed trust world order where identity, privacy, and security are going to be returned back to the control of the of people, whereas, you know, it's probably been, you know, the pendulum has swung a little too far in the opposite direction these days. Okay, let's talk about the fourth industrial revolution. Now, the fourth industrial revolution is coming, whether we are ready or not. Now, what makes a industrial revolution? What is the definition of an industrial revolution? And the one I would get you to think about is that, you know, a fundamental economic change occurs when we see the convergence of energy, logistics, and communication systems. Let me give you some examples. In the first industrial revolution, which occurred in the late 1700s, we saw the advent of steam and coal as the energy sources that we then applied to mechanization, such as locomotion, and we were able to move goods and services using, you know, transport systems such as railway and shipping, you know, across hinterlands and across countries. And of course, the printing press was what we were able to use to communicate en masse. You know, at that time. The second industrial revolution, which occurred approximately 100 years later, characterized by electricity and oil as our energy sources. We applied that to automobiles and aircraft, and now being able to move goods and services, you know, around countries and the world in a very, very different way compared to the past. And of course, we saw the advent of telecommunications, where for the first time we're able to communicate with one another around the world in real time. The third industrial revolution, which is the one that we've mostly lived in, right? It was characterized by nuclear energy, the rise of computing and electronics, and of course the internet mobile technology as our communication systems. And so when we look at the fourth industrial revolution, we shouldn't be really looking at it in any differently to those of the past. I think the first point that I would make here is, unlike the prior industrial revolutions, which were broadly 100 years apart, the fourth industrial revolution is only 50 years apart from the third, and it's characterized by renewable energy and material science as our energy sources. When it comes to looking at communications technology, of course, we're seeing the advent and the rise of fifth generation mobile, Internet of Things, and satellites, and constellations of satellites coming and being launched every year. And of course, the rise of a group of technologies called quantum computing, artificial intelligence, 3D printing, and blockchain, and the like. And so think about the fourth industrial revolution as really being sort of the convergence or the merge or fusion of our digital, physical, biological, and environmental worlds. Now, what's really important here is that what's evolved is what I refer to as a new economic physics. And this is really anchored around this principle of the law of accelerated returns, which is really all about this multiplication effect that occurs when information enables something, and you get this acceleration effect in terms of its growth. So to give you an appreciation of this, the way that we've thought about growth historically has really been, a very linear process where, we've sort of thought, if we want to grow 5% next year, we need this much capital, we need this much labor, we need, these fixed type, assets and resources. Whereas what we've seen emerge is this exponential road where all of a sudden, organizations just explode in their growth. They go from zero to having, billions of customers in a very quick relative, period of time, such as, social media, e-commerce, and the like. Now, what's fascinating about those models is we are seeing a disassociation or a decoupling of the way that we've thought about growth and the supply of scarce resources. And these exponential organizations, are able to achieve this new economic physics where the marginal cost of demand or growth or supply becomes virtually zero. And so the point of disruption occurs when a player on an exponential model in an industry overtakes traditional models that are based on a linear-based model. In other words, they can't scale as an exponential model could. And I'll sort of unpack this in a little bit more detail. Now, I was advising one of the top 10 global banks in the UK at the time about the principle of this exponential. And I'll bring your attention to an organisation that I'll use as a case study to explain this, called TransferWise. TransferWise was founded in 2011 by two Skype workers, Estonian Skype workers, who were based in London at the time and were frustrated by the time and the cost of remitting their salaries from pounds sterling into their Estonian accounts. And when they learnt that it was cheaper and quicker to put cash in a briefcase and fly it from Heathrow to New York than what it was to use the financial system to transfer and move that money, they thought there's got to be a better way to do this. And that's really what seeded their idea of founding their organisation. Now, in 2016, so this is 5 years after TransferWise's inception, again, when I was advising this global institutional bank in London, it was at the time that news broke that TransferWise had recorded its third consecutive quarter of positive growth. Now, at the time, this major global bank said, who in their right mind is going to put their trust in this sort of startup company, to do their international foreign exchange remittance? We're a big global bank. We're over 100 years old. That's what people value. And I said, well, to an extent they do, but you're now participating in the experience economy. And in the experience economy, people are very open to adopt, new experiential innovations to achieve a desired outcome that has, much greater utility than perhaps what you're offering today. And so they pulled the price lever because they thought, we'll just get to parity on price, and that will, thwart these startups, these fintechs. But the complete opposite had happened, because as I advised them was that if you pull the price lever, your traditional model will not scale exponentially, and you'll have the exponential opposite effect of imploding when it comes to looking at your profit line. And sure enough, that happened. And within a very quick period of time, they corrected that. Now, the thing with TransferWise was, from the time that it first turned a positive profit in 2016 to the time that it became Europe's most valuable fintech, valued at 3.5 billion, right? It was just 3 short years. And so this is the point that I want to make about, a world characterized by exponential change, right? And because this is now the environment that we're now living in. And so it's really important for us to think about our business models, right, in a very exponential way. We've got to look at it. How can we change and adapt our business model from a linear-based approach to value creation onto an exponential approach? Now, the reason why this is important is because there's going to be 7 business models that are going to rule this decade. And you're probably familiar with most of these that you've seen and experienced through a variety of services that you've probably already consumed today. And so these business models are not passive hosts. They've taken residence in our last decade, and they will dominate the decade ahead, increasingly through a whole variety of different new value creation sources. But what's common with all of these business models is that it's actually data that is the disruptor. And so when we look at what Australian professionals believe is going to be have the most disruptive impact on their business models over the coming 3 years, unsurprisingly, it's all these technologies. And guess what the common denominator is? It's data. And so there's never been a more important point that I could emphasize, that we've really got to think about how to now compete analytically, and to think about data in a very, very different way. So on the question of, how ready are we to compete analytically, we can think of this through a sort of maturity model. And here's a wonderful model that was developed by 2 wonderful researchers out of Harvard. Their names are Davenport and Harris. And what they looked at was, what stages do organizations go through to become what they call stage 5 analytical competitors. If you want some examples of what a stage 5 analytical competitor is, it would be your Facebooks, your Googles, your Capital One in the United States, Progressive Insurance in the United States. These are organizations who compete basically centered on their data and capability. And I often remind people that when we think about Google and Facebook and Amazon, everyone thinks of them as tech companies. And I remind them that, in fact, they're data companies. They began life understanding how to create economic value based off data. Now, when I applied this study to 78 financial institutions across Asia Pacific, I found that most of those institutions were in either stage 1 or stage 2. And so the point here is that we've got a long way to go in really understanding and translating our insights and our capacity to compete in a data-driven world. But that's really what this decade is going to be about. It's going to be about how do you transform to become an analytical competitor. And so we can't really address that without really understanding the skill sets that we need, because the skill sets that we're going to need to compete analytically are going to be very, very different to the skill sets that we've had before in the past. And this is what's creating what I refer to as an ingenuity gap. Because if we look at a lot of the emerging roles, we require a level of data literacy that transcends and goes way beyond thinking about digital literacy, which was really about where our emphasis was last decade. And so we've got to really think thoughtfully about now, how do we revolutionize the skill sets within our workforces to get ready to adapt to a data-driven and data-literate world. Now, when we look at the question in the study of whether Australian professionals felt that Australia is or isn't investing adequately in technological, scientific, and skills development, compared to other countries over the coming years, we can clearly see that most Australian professionals believe that to be true. Over half, in fact, are quite concerned that we're not investing adequately in this area. And for those respondents in March of last year, again, in the eye of the COVID storm, we can see that this shot up to something like 95%. So in other words, there's this accelerated, desire for us to get going on investments in this area. And so the University of Technology in Sydney has come up with a very, very clever AI-driven platform which helps organisations map the skill sets within their current workforces and then to plan what skill sets they're going to require over the foreseeable future, and then be able to prepare a customized learning pathway, which includes right down to an individual's adaptive capacity, that is the will to learn. And this is the kind of platforms that are going to be critical in order for us to be able to, revolutionize our workforces to really deliver the services that we're looking for over the coming decade. And so what I would say the two tipping points that we really need to, think about here is that, emerging technologies are going to accelerate the speed, scale, and impact of disruption to every nation, industry, organisation, and individual. And we've really got to think about that in a thoughtful way in terms of, those 7 new business models that have emerged over the, over the last decade or more, and will, continue to take residence over the coming decade. We've got to think about technology and the skills that that going to be required for that, and importantly, we've got to perhaps shift our thinking from digital literacy over into data literacy. Okay, now let's talk about some major emerging technological and scientific shifts. Now, think of these as being the clues, as I mentioned before at the start. The question of how do we increase our capacity to adapt to a world of accelerated change is more like a mystery. And so what we've got to be able to look for is where are the corners and what might be around the corner. And that's what I'm going to step you through here. And so the first thing that I would suggest is that rather than thinking about these technologies individually, such as artificial intelligence or 5G or virtual reality, start thinking about what happens when we actually start putting these technologies together. And it's what I refer to as the multiplicative effect. And so if we look at this in terms of, you know, a bit of a roadmap, this is what we can expect this coming decade. So all of these technologies that we hear about, you know, will come into fruition, many of which are already here today. But they're really characterized by major advances that we're seeing in nanotechnology, robotics, and artificial intelligence. And so this will surface a whole range of new value creation ideas and opportunities. But as I mentioned before, we'll see the augmentation of our digital, physical, and biological worlds. And I refer to this as, you know, the 2020s are going to be the programmatic decade, where our lifestyle processes will become programmatic in software. And so we'll see nanobots, for example, inhabit our bodies and be able to solve many of the medical mysteries that have eluded us through precision medicine, you know, medication. We will see virtual reality become indistinguishable from reality by the quality of the networks, the quality of the pixelation in screens, and the like. And, you know, technology will become much more wearable than what we've had, you know, and our appetite for that, say through using smartwatches. All of a sudden our clothing will be able to provide us with many more uses for that, for information. And of course, computers will increasingly have more human level intelligence. And so when it comes to then looking at these technologies, as I mentioned before, it's the multiplicative effect, which is really important. And I'll bring some of these into context with you. So the first two is thinking about what happens when you start thinking about your you know, your data and your services in the cloud. What happens when you start adding artificial intelligence to it, the ability to be able to translate that data you know, at exponential rates compared to what you can do today. Look at what happens when you combine the Internet of Things and devices to provide contextual information, you know, with virtual reality and augmented reality. Think about what happens to the whole notion of trust, as I mentioned before, when you start looking at blockchain technology and distributed ledger technology. And then lastly, what happens to, you know, our capacity to solve many of the complex computations that are quite difficult for us to do or timely to do today through quantum computing. And so let me sort of bring some color into this in terms of what does this really mean for financial services? Well, it will transform the way financial services are structured, provisioned, and distributed through these ways. You'll see ecosystems that are being established beyond finance. You'll see the way with which we think about risk, for example, and the way people choose lifestyles to change completely. The way we think about pricing, you know, health insurance or life insurance. We will see, you know, our physical and digital processes become augmented to the point where we'll be able to, you know, have just-in-time lending. The risk profile of, you know, an individual or a business can be known in real time at any given point in time. And, you know, when we think about reimagining our core functions, we can think about this from being able to use, you know, sophisticated technology like quantum computing to apply it to the way we look at and manage portfolios, for example, of investments. And then lastly, the way with which we think about reorientating transaction flows, within a financial system, a global system, which is reliant upon flows. So let me now get you to some predictions for 2030. And I'll start sort of bringing this together in terms of thinking about some of the experiences that we might be having out to 2030. Now, again, I'll contextualize this within the fusion of our digital, physical, and biological and environmental worlds, where, experiences will become much more immersive, interconnected, intelligent, augmented, and so this will create value and services in completely new and ingenious ways. And so the top 10 customer experience bots we could be experiencing by 2030 look a little like this. As I mentioned before, wearable technology associated with the clothing that we wear for sports and recreational activities will become a lot more intelligent and be able to monitor all of our muscular movement, for example, than what we do today. Just like we'll see an exponential increase in the volume of data that's going to be created this coming decade, so too will the exponential threat that will come at organizations as well as people. And so we can expect to see, a lot more protections associated with our data. Today we have neighbourhood watch in terms of the way with which we look out for our communities. In the digital world, we can see the evolution to the same point as well, where we can see a lot of community support coming online. The way with which we manage our sustainability will become a lot more digitally accessible. And we've all become accustomed to working from home. And I don't believe that we're going to somehow regress back to the pre-COVID world of working from home. And in fact, in a information-driven industry, we'll see a lot more workloads and work functions being distributed from the home. We'll see a lot more advances in virtual assistants that will help us make decisions around a whole variety of things that are associated with our lives. And our expectations of connectivity will also become seamless, irrespective of which geography we move around in or which building or environment that we move around in. And just like we see, and I mentioned before, in terms of threats, we'll see the same emerge in terms of content that's produced and the protections associated with those. So these are sort of some of the experiences that you can expect. People are going to be having this coming decade as a consequence of the multiplication effect of the augmentation of those technologies. So what does this now really mean to an organization? So let's bring it in from the outside in. It means that the way with which people, workers, and organizations create experiences will be completely different. And the frequency of interactions of those three will also exponentially increase as more devices start connecting to the organization as well. We're going to see, cities become a lot more intelligent in terms of the way with which they manage traffic. Shopping centers becoming a lot more intelligent, being able to direct you in terms of, specials buying and the like, autonomous vehicles, be they on road, rail, or in our air systems becoming autonomous. Talked about wearable technologies and machine-to-machine connectivity emerging. So all of these will create, so our external environment, if we think about that and think about inwards, is going to direct an exponential increase in the volume of data that's going to come at your organizations. And so, to compete effectively in the fourth industrial revolution, organizations will need to, learn how to compete analytically. And to do that, they need to become what I refer to as, cognitively intelligent in the data that they use. They'll then apply that data in all of these new and emerging platforms such as quantum computing, artificial intelligence, virtual and augmented reality, to create new services that are yet to be imagined today. But importantly, what this is going to do is allow organizations to create services that live in the customer's time zone, which I refer to as real time, right? That's how we live our lives, rather than consuming services that are 1, 2, or more days late. Now, this environment's going to live in next generation networks, which will become the marketplaces for how you consume services. And we've already made a significant step forward in that direction with cloud computing. And we can expect that this will accelerate in terms of intelligent networks with 5th generation mobile networks, the constellations of video of satellites that are being launched by SpaceX and Amazon and a range of European players as well. And so, as I mentioned before, in a world that's characterized by an exponential rise in data and devices and systems connecting to them, so too will the threat surface, and we need to think about protecting our organizations in completely new and different ways. And this is what will fuse the digital, physical and biological worlds. And so this is what I call the blueprint for the enterprise in the 4th industrial revolution. So let me summarize. The 4th industrial revolution is coming whether we are ready or not. And so we've really got to think quite differently about this industrial revolution compared to industrial revolutions of the past. And that's because we're now seeing this new emergence of exponential models that have a new economic physics. These are the 7 business models that I referred to earlier. And those business models are really powered by data. That is their fuel. And so we've really got to prepare ourselves to, compete analytically. Look for that youthquake. We know that intergenerational wealth shift is occurring. And we know that on the back of significant social, cultural, political, and technological change, so too becomes evident that there are significant opportunities. But to deal with that, we need to steer into the productivity imperative, and technology will be the key for us as we have an aging population and the way with which we think about supporting that population through time. Trust is a renewable energy. It has certainly taken a battering in terms of financial services over the last sort of 3 to 5 years, but it is a renewable energy, and it'll be renewable for a digital life, which will be augmented with technology. And when it comes to technology, we need to really look at the multiplicative effect of technologies rather than looking at these technologies in of their own. And of course, the key to competing and surviving in this next decade is really about adaptation and rejuvenation, rather than thinking about transformation as a once-off event. And the Enterprise 4.0 is the business architecture that I believe will characterize what organization's success looks like. But really, it begins with you as individuals. Juvenescence is not just about a model for operating an organization. It really is about leadership. And I think it's described eloquently here by the fact that reminding ourselves that that adaptation is not a concept that is new to us. In fact, it's Darwinian theory of survival. But that philosophy of being constantly rejuvenated and constant adaptation will become prevalent this coming decade. And so my closing thought for you is, get your juvenescence on, whether that's, to think about that as leadership or the way that you think about your organizations, and find that youthquake, right? That's where all of the new economic value is there to be created. And don't ever think that, that this is just sort of limited to, organizations that are, your Amazons or your Googles. We've got to remind ourselves that all good ideas of every industrial revolution, began as an idea that was imagined in someone's mind. And so, I hope these insights have been insightful for you. I hope it's been really helpful in thinking about the decade ahead, being able to think about how to rejuvenate yourselves and your organizations. And I'd be delighted to, remain connected with you. Here is my contact details, and everything that I've spoken about is contained in a lot more detail in the 2 books that I've published over the coming years. Thank you for your time today.
Thanks so much, Rocky. That was really interesting, and it's fascinating and relevant for financial planners and business owners. And there's a whole lot of concepts there that are relevant to their world in terms of the aging population, the rise of millennials, the increase in debt, and particularly trust. The point you made about what we trust, I think, is very interesting. I think all those things, though, it really comes back to that concept of juvenescence. And I wrote down the definition because I really like it. Success is determined by a constant capacity to adapt. It's something that is highly relevant for financial planners. So that concludes our webinar today. Thank you very much for attending. We hope you've enjoyed it and learned something from it, and we'll see you again next time.